Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to give a few more minutes, or just a minute or so more, to get a few more people on here and settled, and then we will get started.
Welcome, everyone.
All right. So just to jump in, quickly to introduce a couple of the key presenters today. One is Edward Ionel. He is on our product management team. He is an engineer, and he will be leading you through our discussion today on securely sharing clusters through Kubernetes. Also with us is Nick Chase, who is head of Mirantis content. So he helps pull together all of the material that you see come across our website and the emails and things like that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Edward and Nick, and I will be here for support as needed. And thanks for joining today.
Excellent, Lisa. Thank you so much for the introduction. Very nice to see all of you guys here today, wherever you are from across the world. I am based in San Francisco. I know Nick is on the East Coast of North America, and we could not be more excited to be joining each and every single one of you today for a fantastic webinar on how to share access to a Kubernetes cluster securely through Lens Spaces. Before beginning into the presentation itself and the demo-rich webinar, this is a demo-rich webinar, I do want to launch a poll to get a better understanding of where all of you guys are from, maybe how long you've been using Lens, and where you are in your Kubernetes journey. So in just a matter of seconds, I'm going to be launching the poll, and I'm looking forward to seeing where everybody is from across the world. And again, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. We could not be more excited to be with you on this excellent webinar. So I'll be launching the first poll. And the first poll is, where is everyone from? And I did see somebody in the chat is from Egypt, so welcome. Welcome to today's webinar. It's a jam-packed session, and I'm quite excited to have each and every single one of you here with us.
Hey, and just to make sure everybody can see where the vote, underneath the video box where Edward is talking, there is an option for your ask a question, and then to vote, simply click on that and you will see your options for submitting your response.
Excellent, thanks, Lisa. I can see some responses are coming in. So 57% of our audience are from the Americas, whether that's North America, South America, or Central America. 33% of our audience is from Asia Pacific. Welcome, everybody. That's fantastic to see. And we have 11% of our audience from EMEA. Awesome. And the polls are changing since they are live, but that is all right. Let's continue with the next polling question. I'm quite curious about this one. And this one is specifically around Lens. How long have you been using Lens? Myself, I've been using it for over a year now, and it's the #1 IDE that I use whenever I'm leveraging anything with my Kubernetes clusters, whether it's debugging or pushing commits and so forth. I leverage Lens for all of these different things, especially when it comes to observability in my cluster, situational awareness, understanding real-time events with my cluster, and neat things like deploying applications via Helm packages and so forth. I can see a large percent of the people filling out this poll have not used Lens. 66% of our audience today has not leveraged Lens, the IDE. So that is quite interesting to see. And because of that, we will somewhat tune our webinar to the people that have not leveraged Lens. But of course, this webinar is how to share access to your Kubernetes cluster, leveraging Lens spaces. So we'll absolutely still touch on that. But I do want to show some capabilities that Lens has for the individuals with us today that have not leveraged Lens. 16% of our audience has been using Lens from 1 month to 3 months. Excellent to see. 3 months to 6 months is 8%. 6 months to a year is 4%, and over 1 year is 7%. Excellent. But 65% of our audience has not used Lens. So we will take a deeper dive into the Lens IDE and the value prop that there is there, especially when working with multiple Kubernetes clusters. We'll end this poll and ask another question. I'm curious what everybody's job function are. And I do apologize here. We did group some together, and that's just because of the fact that we can only have 5 answers. So we did group a couple of these together. I apologize for that. I very well understand that some of them are not the other, right? So we understand that, but we did have to group some of these together. And I thought you guys should know. So 40% of our audience are either a developer or an architect. We have some SecOps here, and of course, DevOps. I'm guessing many of you guys are from the DevOps side. And then we have 8% of our audience that are, or 11% now, it just changed very quickly, either an operator, an IT admin, a site reliability engineer, or you're associated with scientific research, you're a data analyst, and so forth. But I'm guessing most of you guys are either operators, IT admins, or SREs. And we have 4% that are students or interns. Welcome. That's exciting to see. That's really, really exciting to see. And I'm hoping I can teach each and every single one of you guys something new when it comes to Lens, the Kubernetes IDE. We will end this poll as well. And we have just 2 more questions, guys, and then we'll jump into the webinar itself, start with the presentation, and of course, it's a demo-rich webinar. This question I love to ask just to get a better understanding of how far along you are in your Kubernetes adoption journey, whether you're still in the learning or educational phase, in development, proof of concept, or you've deployed directly into production. I'm sure there's many of you individuals here today that have deployed in production, as well as, of course, in development stages, proof of concept stages, and so forth. We'll give it another 15 seconds for this particular question. It looks like 54% of our audience has deployed in production. Awesome to see. 36% are in the educational learning phase. Wow. 5% in development, and an additional 10% in the proof of concept stage. This is quite insightful for me today, seeing so many individuals still in that education and learning stage, which is absolutely cool. That's exciting to see. And everybody else that's more experienced, welcome. It will be a jam-packed webinar today as well. We'll end this poll. And the last question is another question I love to ask, and it is, what are your biggest challenges when working with Kubernetes? Whether it's complexity, storage, security, maybe cultural changes, that's always a big answer as well. So I'm curious to see what your challenges are and how they actually match up to the CNCF report of 2020, that one of the biggest ones were definitely complexity and cultural changes. That's 2 of the biggest responses that we saw in the CNCF. So we'll give it another 25 seconds or so, and then we'll review the results. Excellent. So we can see that 30% of you individuals have complexity being one of the biggest challenges with Kubernetes. That absolutely makes sense. 18% see cultural changes or development, 45% answered security. That's another big challenge when we're working with Kubernetes. And Lens Spaces somewhat helps with that when we talk about sharing access to a specific Kubernetes cluster. Lens Spaces touches on that as well. And 8% are storage. So without further ado, I want to thank each and every single one of you guys one more time for joining us today, answering our polling questions, taking the time out of your day. From here, we actually are going to jump into the presentation, talk about the presentation for roughly 10 minutes or so, and then we will jump into the demo pack webinar itself, where we will talk about Lens IDE as a whole, because I noticed that so many of our audience today actually haven't leveraged Lens, and we will also take a look at the ability to share access to a Kubernetes cluster securely via Lens Spaces. Excellent. Let's get started. I'll start by sharing my screen. We'll jump into my presentation. I imagine everybody can see this. Well, great. So I'm Edward ENL, and today we'll be talking about Lens, the Kubernetes IDE, specifically around how to share access to a Kubernetes cluster securely. A little bit about myself. I'm focused on growth and developer relations here at Mirantis. I am on the product team, as Lisa mentioned, and I really want to seek out the pain points within cloud-native technologies, Kubernetes, and other cloud-native technologies to really help streamline developer operator initiatives when working with these complex technologies. So this slide, I'm sure we all already agree on this, and we just took a look at the polling, but Kubernetes is quite challenging. Organizations, peoples, individuals, teams want to invest in Kubernetes, but typically we can see that developers may think it's complicated or adoption is slow. Organizations or yourself may not be seeing the return on investment that you would like to see when working with your container initiatives or Kubernetes. This is where Lens comes in. Lens is a 100% open source desktop application for all of your Kubernetes needs. It works with any certified Kubernetes distro, whether that's Minikube, EKS, GKE, K0s, and so forth, as well as being able to allow developers to easily onboard and operate with their applications when leveraging Kubernetes. The goal of Lens itself and our team is really to improve productivity, increase return on investment, while decreasing overall time to market for whatever your container initiatives are. Here I have some stats. Let me actually just close my Slack real quick. Sorry about that, guys. Here we have some quick stats that I just updated today before our webinar. So Lens is the self-proclaimed world's most popular Kubernetes IDE. And we have some stats to back that claim up. We have over 15,000 GitHub Stargazers, 225,000 users with over 6 million downloads. I do want to mention that Lens became an open source project back in March of 2020, and we've seen quite a bit of growth, and we really just want to thank the cloud native community and the ecosystem for this growth. We couldn't be here where we are today without each and every single one of the individuals within the cloud native ecosystem. So thank you all so much for leveraging Lens for your Kubernetes needs and helping the product and open source technology grow. So here are the 3 features that we were planning on talking about today, but we will also talk about other features within Lens since we saw that there's such a large audience that haven't yet leveraged Lens. So the first is Spaces. Spaces should be thought of as a cloud-based centralized feature within Lens, the IDE. Spaces allows users to create a secure space, add a cluster to that space, and share access to that cluster securely via the space itself. Meaning today, and we'll demonstrate this, I can create a space, add my colleague Nick to that space, share a cluster to that space, and Nick will have access to that Kubernetes cluster. That being said, I do want to mention that we're always leveraging the role-based access control from your kubeconfig file. So if he does not have the correct permissions within the kubeconfig file, he will not be able to do specific admin functions to that cluster itself, like shelling into a node or draining the node or viewing logs and so forth, or deploying the Helm chart within the cluster itself. So we're always leveraging your role-based access control. no matter what. And this is across Lens as a whole. Even when you're not leveraging Lens spaces, if you import a cluster to Lens and you don't have the correct permissions, you won't be able to do specific functionalities that an admin may be able to do. So that's first, and that's Lens spaces. And that's the main feature we will be talking about today. The next one is a new feature also brought to Lens with the last release, which is Lens 5, which is the unified catalog. The catalog should be thought of as your cloud native directory for all of your cloud native resources, whether it's clusters, services, workloads, tools, automations, and so forth. The catalog is a beautiful, customizable directory built within the Lens desktop application that you can leverage for whatever container initiative you have. And the next feature we'll be taking a look at today is hotbars. And this also is new with Lens 5. All three of these features that we just talked about are new with Lens 5. But hotbars should be thought of as the main navigation. And really what it does is it allows our users to build specific workflows within the desktop application, hopefully creating a much more automated process when working with Kubernetes clusters or other cloud native technologies and resources. And we'll take a deep dive into this during the demo itself. And this is actually one of my favorite features, as mentioned, because of the fact that we can create workflows, automations, and so forth. And again, we'll touch on this in just a minute, but it's a very, very cool feature, and it's one of my favorite. So we talked about these things just a second ago, and these are the things we'll be taking a look at. So we'll take a look at how to share access to a Kubernetes cluster via Lens spaces, how you can access your cloud native resources within your catalog, and how you can build specific workflows via the hotbar, which once again is the main navigation. I do want to pause here just for a second and talk a little bit about other features within Lens IDE, since we do have an audience with us today that have not leveraged Lens. Lens IDE allows you to really take the pain out of multi-cluster Kubernetes management, meaning I can have various different clusters, 10s, 20s, even hundreds of clusters on Lens desktop application, and I can switch from cluster to cluster while always connecting to the correct Kubernetes API endpoint, meaning when I switch from this cluster, from my K0s cluster to my K8s cluster, Lens auto-magically, yes, I'm using that word, auto-magically connects to the correct cluster endpoint, which is extremely important. And this is where that productivity increases, where you're increasing efficiency, and you're also decreasing user error. Because to switch from cluster to cluster, as we all know, it's challenging. We have to write more command lines and ensure that we're working within the correct cluster. Lens allows us to do this without writing any command line, and we're always automatically connected to that cluster's endpoint.
Hey, Edward.
Go ahead.
Edward, before you go on, just to clarify, you're not showing slides right now, correct?
Oh, I have been.
Aha. Well, your slides have disappeared, my friend.
That's all right. Let's just jump directly into the demo then. Have you guys seen any of the slides?
Your slides were showing until about a minute ago when you started talking about the different features.
That's fine. So you saw the three features that we spoke about: the hotbar, the spaces, as well as the catalog.
I know spaces was shown. I don't know about the other two, but we'll see them when you demo them.
Excellent. Well, I will touch a little bit further on this, and I'm not sharing a slide now, but at least about these features. The next feature I wanted to talk about for the audience is the pre-built-in Prometheus, and this allows Lens to give our users the ability to observe their cluster in a very beautiful way, being able to see how your CPU is running on that cluster to your memory and so forth. From here, let's jump into the demo itself. We'll start off by taking a look at more of Lens IDE's features. Then we'll take a look at spaces, catalog, and hotbar. And if you guys weren't able to see some of my screens in the presentation, that's all right. I was able to explain it, and hopefully you guys were able to gather that information, digest that information. And if not, I will reiterate that in the demo itself. Excellent. So before moving further, let's just make sure you guys can still see my screen. So I'm currently opening up Lens.
Okay, we do not see that. So go ahead and reshare your screen.
Excellent. So we will do a reshare. I imagine you guys can see my screen now.
Now we see it.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. I'm curious to why it didn't share. Maybe that was my fault. Excellent. So this is Lens 5. And again, Lens 5 is a Kubernetes IDE that really allows you to have all situational awareness when working with your Kubernetes clusters. To start, we will be taking a look at all of Lens features prior to Lens 5, and then of course, how to share access to a Kubernetes cluster. So here's our hotbar on the left-hand side, and here's our catalog. On this hotbar, I actually have specific clusters already added to my desktop application. Here I'm opening up our cluster, and it immediately gives us a cluster overview screen with the pre-built-in Prometheus of how our cluster is performing in the last hour. So everybody knows I am actually zoomed in quite a bit on my screen, and I'll just zoom out just so people can see the UI. But you can see how the cluster is performing in the last hour, from the CPU to the memory and the pods. I'll zoom back in for the demo, and we'll get started. So another very neat functionality, and I talked about this just a bit earlier, is being able to switch from cluster to cluster while always maintaining the correct Kubernetes endpoint. So if I write a quick command line within our terminal, we can see my nodes here. Within Lens, and we can see the version, of course, but within Lens, we can always see our nodes here as well without having to write any command line. But the point I'm getting at is now I'm going to switch to a completely different cluster. Lens will connect to this cluster. And if I go to our terminal and run the same command line, we can see that the nodes are different, right? And the version as well. So when I switch from cluster to cluster, we're always maintaining the correct Kubernetes endpoint. So if I'm within my workloads, I'm in my overview screen and I want to work with my pods, I can click into my pods and I know that I'm always connected to this Kubernetes cluster because I switched over to it by clicking the smart console on the left-hand side. Excellent. From here, let's take a look at various other functionalities. So one of the things that Lens really gives us is the ability to observe all of our Kubernetes objects in one beautiful UI. I can filter through these objects. Currently, we're looking at all of our pods, but I can also filter by namespace if I choose to do so. I can see how that particular object is running, the status of that object, the namespace is associated to what it's controlled by, the replica set, and so forth. But I also have the ability to actually click directly into this object and get much more granular insights of how this object's performing. And again, this is that pre-built-in Prometheus that Lens leverages. So from my CPU to my memory, my network, and of course my file system, I can view when it was created, the namespaces associated with, the labels, again, what it's controlled by, and so forth. So this is a great way to be able to very easily understand everything within our Kubernetes cluster without having to write any command line. I, of course, can jump directly into our pod logs to get a better understanding of our logs and this pod itself if I choose to do so. And of course, Lens, since it is an IDE, you can always create configuration changes, you can debug, you can test, and you can deploy various different things to your Kubernetes cluster or object. We can view our deployments as mentioned. And this UI follows all objects across Lens, meaning I can always take a look at my Nginx deployments. Lens also allows you to bring in different resources if you choose to do so. So I can create a resource. I won't do this today for demonstration purposes, but I can create a resource. I'm pretty sure I actually have one in my notes. Let me see if I do. Yeah, I do. Here, we can just do this real quick. I'll grab this. I can paste it and I can click create and close, and we automatically just created this new resource, this deployment, an Nginx deployment directly into Lens. From here, we even have the ability to leverage Kubernetes to actually scale this deployment up or down if we choose to do so. So I can scale this up to 15, Click scale, and we begin creating additional containers on this deployment itself. As you guys can see here, we can also view them here within our pods, and you can see that they're beginning to be deployed and created. These warning signs are another thing brought to Lens as well, which it gives you a real-time message of what is happening to that particular object, which is very interesting to see. So we're actually going to go back to our deployments and scale that right back down. It shouldn't be scaled that high. Whoops, that's a different deployment. And I already had an Nginx deployment here, as you guys could see. So again, the CPU, the memory, the network, the file system, how it's performing in the last hour. We're going to scale this back down to 1 scale, and you can see Kubernetes begins terminating those containers. Excellent. Now that we've done this, we're actually going to try to power forward through all of the other features within Lens IDE, so we can still showcase how to share access to a Kubernetes cluster securely via Lens spaces. So real quick, if we scroll to the bottom, we have our charts. These are our Helm charts. There's thousands of different repos you can leverage here. I only have several currently configured, but you have the ability to change the repos, add repos, remove repos within the settings, within Lens settings. But from here, we could always find the Helm chart we care most about, open it up, and within 2 clicks, we can install this Helm chart directly to our cluster very, very easily. If I click install, it'll install this Helm chart directly to our cluster. It'll show us all resources that were created, how they're related to one another, and so forth. I don't want to touch on this too much just because we have a different agenda today, but this is another core functionality that Lens gives you, right? So you have the ability to see how your cluster is performing in the last hour through the pre-built-in Prometheus, switching from cluster to cluster while always connected to the correct Kubernetes endpoint, viewing how your Kubernetes objects are performing. You also have the ability to deploy Helm charts, edit resources, view logs, and of course with admin functionality, you can even drain nodes, cardone them, and so forth up on the top right. And again, I do want to mention that much of this functionality may not be available to you if you do not have the correct role-based access control from your kubeconfig file. That's extremely important to note. Excellent. From here, the last thing we'll take a look at before switching back over to the main purpose of today's webinar is actually the extensions API. So with Lens 4, which was released back in December, we released the ability to have extensions on top of Lens. There's 2 great reasons why that's awesome. One, it allows our partners or other organizations within the cloud native ecosystem to leverage Lens and build technologies on top of Lens that allows our users to leverage that technology. So it's almost a 2-for-1. New startups that are within the cloud native ecosystem can create awesome extensions on top of Lens, and our users can utilize these awesome extensions. So we'll take a look at a quick extension. It's actually my favorite extension that's currently out, and it's the Kubernetes Resource Manifest. This extension is actually built by Team Lens, and I'll share a link at the end of our presentation where you can find all publicly made extensions. There are over 100 current extensions. Many of those are private, but we have roughly 10 or 15 that are public extensions for anybody to use. And again, anybody can create an extension. So why do I like this extension? This extension tells me exactly how all of my resources within my cluster are related to one another. And I can, of course, get details on that particular pod, deployment, and so forth, and also see what it's related to. And then, of course, if I click any of these things, we immediately get that granular view of that particular object in real time, which is awesome. Excellent. So I know that was extremely quick when going over most of Lens IDE's features, but we do have an agenda today, and that is with Lens Spaces. So Lens Spaces, again, is a cloud-based centralized enhancement brought to Lens IDE, and you do need to create an account to be able to access Lens Spaces. The reason for this is simply security. And to create an account, you would hit that icon on the bottom right, Lens Login, and it'll immediately redirect you in your browser to this page. I do want to mention that all user data is completely encrypted from end to end, and we do not share any of this data with third parties. So to create an account, you would create an account down at the bottom, new to Lens Spaces, create an account. I'm already a user, so I'm going to log into my Lens Spaces. Simply logging in. I had a feeling that I did that. That's fine. We'll refresh real quick. Excellent. We're now logged in. I'll open Lens. And at the bottom right, you can see my name, Edward. We're going to go back to our catalog, which is this button here. And this is always changeable if you choose to do so. If you want your catalog here, you can have it there. But we'll go back to my catalog, where again, we can see all of our resources within Lens, the desktop application, from my clusters to my web links, and of course to my spaces. You guys can see that here. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a space, add a cluster to that space, and then share that space with my team member, Nick, who is here with us today. And he will be able to accept the invitation and then be able to actually access that Kubernetes cluster. So to start, we do need to create a space. Let's call this space BrightTalk. I know, I just came up with that. It was quick. BrightTalk. The space has now been created, and we can see that space here. If I click this button here, it'll actually open the space in the settings. And I can go to members and actually invite members to this space. Before doing so, I'm actually going to add a cluster to that space. So we will add this cluster. We'll click share. We'll find the space we want to add it to, which is the BrightTalk space. And here is where we actually install Cluster Connect. And Cluster Connect is the technology behind Lens Spaces that allows us to share access to that Kubernetes cluster securely. The technology behind Cluster Connect is also an open source technology that Team Lens has built, which is called BoardD, and it creates a tunneling from the cluster to the Kubernetes proxy. So if I install this Cluster Connect, it'll take a moment. And we do install this directly to that cluster so everybody knows. Now, I'm actually going to go back to my space, which is the BrightTalk space. We'll open it. We'll go to our members. And Nick, this is where I'm going to need your username. I believe it is just Nick, but I'm not positive. So
it is, yes.
It is? Excellent. So I'm going to click enter. And the invitation has been sent to Nick. From here, what I'm going to do, everyone, is actually stop sharing my screen and give the ball to Nick. So we'll do a stop share.
Okay, so I will share my screen. I will come over here to Lens. So I'll log into Lens. Okay, and I'm lazy, so I'm just going to log in with Google. Okay, then there we are. Okay, so now where do I go from here? So if I go to my profile, and I'm trying to remember how I do this. So if I go to my profile and then I go to spaces, there it is. So I can accept it. And then if I go to spaces, I see there it is.
Yep.
And if I go to clusters, there's the cluster. All right.
And then you can click to open it. Now, I do want to mention to everybody that he has limited functionality on this cluster. This is my cluster, and I do not want to give Nick too much functionality when leveraging my cluster. But as we can see, we actually shared the cluster directly with Nick, and or not the cluster, but access to the cluster itself. And again, the functions he's able to perform are all based off of the kubeconfig file and the role-based access control given. So
So I don't get to see his pods because I have a tendency to break things.
Yeah, I actually would trust you, but for that particular for that particular cluster, we didn't go ahead and gave him the correct kubeconfig author permissions. But as you guys can see, he can now see the K8s cluster on his desktop application when logged into Lens Spaces. So this is where Lens Spaces becomes extremely, extremely powerful for large teams and enterprises, being able to share access to a kubeconfig file or not to the cluster, and users can perform various different actions based off of that role-based access control that we've talked about already. This is really, really, really cool. Our team uses it day in and day out to test, debug, and actually help others with their Kubernetes clusters. From here, Nick, I am going to ask you to stop sharing, and I'll take the ball back.
You bet.
Thank you. So I will share again, everybody. We'll jump back to Spaces. And we'll talk a little bit about Catalog, as well as the Hotbar. So here's the Catalog. We've talked about this. Many of you guys probably already realize what it is, but it is all of your cloud native resources within the desktop application that you can easily view and leverage at any given point. So it's filtered in several ways. You have your general, so your catalog, your preferences. You can add anything here if you choose to do so. You have your clusters, how to add a cluster. Adding a cluster with Lens 5 is quite simple. Lens will actually search your operating system for a kubeconfig file and automatically add that cluster. If it cannot find that cluster, you can actually just copy and paste the kubeconfig directly into this terminal here, and it will launch the cluster itself. You have your web links. This is actually a very cool functionality brought to Lens 5 as well that we haven't talked about. You have your spaces, being able to create your space very, very quickly, add team members to it. So if I go to my BrightTalk, I can easily go here, go to members, and I can actually remove Nick from this space now. And now he will not have access to that space or that cluster anymore, which is actually quite interesting. You can actually also create teams where you would have specific admins to that space. You can give those individuals additional permissions, like adding more team members and so forth. But we won't take a look at that as of now. What we will take a look at now, before moving on to the Hotbar, is being able to actually create a web link. And this is one of my favorite features brought to Lens 5, and it's quite self-explanatory, but we'll still talk about it. The reason why I like web links so much is because I can just click the Kubernetes documentation and Lens will automatically push us to that browser, pull up the web page that we're interested in, and we can begin working very, very quickly. So what I do is I will have like a kubectl cheat sheet, and we're actually building one at Mirantis, so stay tuned for that. But I'll have a kubectl cheat sheet that I'll leverage whenever I'm trying to perform specific functions within my cluster that the Lens IDE doesn't allow me to do through the UI, right? And we saw with the UI, we can always view pods. And to answer someone's question, I saw that somebody asked it, Lens does connect to the pods. It absolutely connects. It's not just being able to view. I can edit this resource in real time and make changes if I choose to do so. And that's why it's actually an IDE and not just a dashboard, right? It's the ability to perform specific functions to our cluster, object, and so forth. Going back to our catalog, we'll actually create a web link real quick. It's quite easy to do so. You just hit this plus button and you would enter a link and the URL. Let's see if I have one that I would want to leverage. Let's just do LinkedIn, just for demonstration purposes. I can grab this, go back to Lens, enter the link, click enter, give it a name, Edward's LinkedIn feed, hit enter. And here we'll actually take a look, and I've added it before, and here we'll take a look at Hotbar. I can immediately pin this to my Hotbar, as well as additional clusters. I have all my clusters pinned, but I can add this new cluster, which is the Spaces cluster, to my Hotbar. And this is where you begin to create automations and somewhat of workflows. So if I click this, as you guys can imagine, it opens LinkedIn, right? But the reason why this is so neat is if you click on this number 1 at the bottom, you can create folders for your hotbars, meaning this first page here, which is labeled number 1, I can name that production clusters. So everything within this section of the hotbar, page 1, will be everything I need for my production grade clusters, whether it's to open up a support email or a Jira ticket, or open up the Kubernetes cluster that I'm working with, or a kubectl command cheat sheet, or anything along those lines. I can easily add them to this specific hotbar, this folder, and begin doing any type of activity for that specific purpose, whether again it's proof of concept clusters, production clusters, and so forth. So I can add a hotbar, give it a name, proof of concept. We add that, that's on page 4. And then of course, going to my catalog, I can begin adding any type of thing within our directory, within our catalog, to this specific hotbar. So I know that was a ton of information today, everyone. We talked about Lens IDE's core functionalities, multi-cluster management, pre-built in Prometheus, viewing logs, viewing different objects, being able to deploy a Helm chart, the extensions API, and of course the new features brought with Lens 5, which is spaces, hotbar, and catalog. I really, again, want to thank each and every single one of you guys for joining us. From here, I do want to open it up for questions, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to jump back over to the talk, and let's see what kind of questions we have. How to give access to a team member only on specific namespace in cluster through spaces. I believe that is given actually through your kubeconfig file. That's an excellent question, though. Does Lens just read Prometheus and pod logs? I answered this question already. It's an excellent question, but it does not just read them. You can actually perform specific actions, and you are communicating with the pods itself. When you get a chance, can you speak a little bit about Docker Mirantis merger going on, and what are your thoughts on the Kubernetes issued statement about dropping not sure Docker? I have no thoughts here, unfortunately, guys. I'm not really involved with that part of the business. Excellent question, but unfortunately I can't answer that. It looks like we got another question. If Lens user interface can show the resources within a cluster and their relationship, then why let user edit the kubeconfig file? Instead, does it have the option of extracting these services so that the user does not need to know the syntax of the YAML and the commands? Well, wouldn't that be based off of your kubeconfig file, right? So it's off of the permission. So I don't really understand what you are asking.
I think what they're asking, Edward, is the reasoning behind giving users access to the YAML. And I think, to my mind, that just has to do with the fact that that's the way a lot of people work, as they work with the YAML.
Absolutely, absolutely. Many people do work with the YAML, and again, it's an IDE, so we want people to be able to make these changes. Excellent question. Any other questions? Let's see. Let me take a look. How does Lens Spaces work? So Lens Spaces will aggregate all Kubernetes clusters, and they will expose them via the secure Lens Kubernetes proxy to the end users. Lens Spaces installs the Cluster Connect agent to the desired cluster. That can be done automatically when creating a space and adding the cluster to that space. Cluster Connect is the main technology for Lens Spaces, but the technology behind Cluster Connect is an open source technology called BoardD. And anybody can go ahead and use that as well if they choose to do so. And yeah, any other questions that I see? Is Lens available as a web version? No, Lens is not a web version. It's only a desktop application. There may be a point in time in our roadmap where we decide to actually be able to launch it as a web app. As of right now, that isn't there. So you can't edit the permissions on the cluster itself. You would have to do that within the kubeconfig file, Jean. Sorry if I butchered your name. Access to cloud deployed Kubernetes clusters. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. For the EKS, can you access to cloud deployed Kubernetes clusters be shared as well via spaces like EKS? Absolutely. Yes, you can. I know there's some more hoops you have to jump through to be able to actually add EKS clusters to Lens because of the security of these clusters, but you absolutely can. And majority of our users are leveraging EKS clusters on Lens. You can port forward with Lens. I think Lens.
Just so you know, the audience can't see the questions, so you probably want to.
I should read them. Thank you. Like port forwarding and replica sets, I think Lens can provide adding a resource like database service, drag and drop, and let Lens update the YAML. Interesting. I understand. That's a fantastic suggestion. I'm actually going to copy and paste this and share this with the core development team. That's actually a fantastic one. Thank you. Let's take a look at another question. How does Lens handle access control to your Kubernetes clusters? We talked about this already, but Lens will automatically inherit the access control from your user's kubeconfig file that is imported directly into Lens and the user face itself. So we're always leveraging your role-based access control. What different flavors of Kubernetes clusters does Lens work with? I touched on this a little bit during our presentation. Lens works with any certified conformant of Kubernetes, whether it's MKE, EKS, K0s, K3s, and so forth. It works with any certified Kubernetes distro.
So, Edward, just to just kind of extend the analogy here, if Lens works with any certified Kubernetes distro,
yes,
and Spaces works with any Kubernetes distro that Lens works with, essentially, Spaces works with any certified Kubernetes distro. Is that correct?
That is correct. Absolutely. Cool. It looks like we have another question here. Does Lens have feature of sending alerts, sending mails in case of damage to a cluster or damage to pods inside cluster? This is actually a great one. So there are real-time events that are sent to the user within the desktop application. So I can see when I have warning messages to a pod, when there's errors happening to any Kubernetes object, but it won't necessarily send messages, let's say like via email to somebody or via Slack. We do want to implement that in the roadmap where there can be an alert and we would alert a specific team member to that space or whoever owns that specific cluster that is coming. But when you are leveraging Lens, the desktop application, you absolutely can see real-time events and warning messages that are happening. How can we do automated deployment with Lens and Spaces? I'm sorry, but I do not understand your question. Nick, do you?
I think what they're asking is there a way to automate the deployment of Lens? Because I mean, the automated deployment of Spaces. Okay, so let's kind of back up for a second. Can you automate deployment of Lens? That I don't know the answer to. Do you know the answer to that?
No, I do not know the answer.
So we'll have to find out. We'll have to find that out. But here's the second question. You talked about automations within Lens. Can one of those automations be creating a space and adding a cluster to it?
Yeah, so you can absolutely create a space, but it wouldn't necessarily be an automation, right? You still have to go through the workflow that I presented earlier, where you add a space, you create the space, add the space, invite team members. Now, what you can do is you can add that space to the hotbar and be able to immediately access the settings of that space and invite team members very quickly. I wouldn't say that's an automated process, though. If I deployed service mesh like Istio, can Lens Detect communicate with it? Yes. That's in the custom resources within Lens.
Ah, okay. Somebody's clarifying that automation question.
Can you pull users from IDE and such and avoid using GUI, aka is there an API or CLI? No.
But it sounds like a good feature to request from the Lens team.
Yeah, let me take note of that. Can you pull users? No. Excellent.
Good guy to ask.
Yeah, so 2 great feedbacks that I received today. Any other questions, everybody? It looks like we've had almost 20 questions today. That's quite cool to see. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions. I do want to thank, again, everybody that has joined us today, wherever you are in the world, at any time that you've joined. I know we are all very busy, and I want to thank you guys. So really do enjoy the conversation we had, the demo, and the presentation. I really do appreciate each and every single one of your time. And I do want to share my screen one more time to show where you guys can connect with me, where you can find Lens, and so forth. So here's our GitHub repo, our website, my email, the Lens email, and please join our Slack community. We do a ton of different giveaways within our Slack community. This is where we can speak with individuals. This is where you can actually speak with our developers, our core contributors to the project themselves, ask any question, help troubleshoot with your clusters. It's really a great forum for any type of question you have, whether it's Lens related or just Kubernetes related. We have some really senior developers, architects, and so forth there, always answering questions. And we would love your feedback. Any type of feedback that you guys have, good or bad, we really do appreciate it. And we do want to have the community be such a part of the roadmap and us building this awesome open source technology. So take a screenshot of this or write them down and so forth. But please join us on our Slack community. Give Lens a try if you haven't. Try Lens 5 and Lens Spaces. Let me know what you think. I would love to share a Kubernetes cluster with any single one of you guys. So thank you so much. I will jump back to the questions one last time. Let me stop sharing my screen. Thank you for responding to my questions. How much help does Lens provide troubleshooting, such as a resource not starting up, a pod not responding? Does it provide basic sanity type? Yeah, it does. It does. It will tell you what's going on. It will tell you what's going on, but it will not make changes without going into the kubectl. I have 3 squads. I want to give Kubernetes access for them. Can I give access for each squad to a specific namespace? I do not believe so directly with Lens spaces. I do not believe so. Not directly with Lens spaces. Is there any limit on the numbers of clusters managed? Not for Lens IDE. We have users with 10s, 20, 30s different clusters with many nodes. I mean, massive clusters and massive production clusters. So there is no limit for Lens IDE. I believe there is a limit for how many clusters you can share via Lens spaces. And that's because we do have some backend resource spend to be able to provide this type of service to the community itself. Well, excellent. We're almost at the top of the hour. It doesn't seem like we have any more questions. Thank you all for joining us today. I know it was a jam-packed session, and thanks for the amazing questions. Thank you, everyone.